Have you ever felt like you were living, but not as yourself? As if every gesture was rehearsed, every word edited, every day endured in silence? Lucas knew that feeling well. To others, he was just a reserved man, but inside, he was in exile. Not from society, not from opportunity, but from himself. And that's where many people live, hidden behind a functional life, while slowly losing themselves on the inside. Life only began to change for Lucas when he stopped running and found the courage to finally face himself. Before anything changed, Lucas had to face a truth he'd been avoiding for years. He wasn't just hiding from the world, he was hiding from his own life. This refusal to step into the world isn't merely fear, it's a form of self-protection. It's a way to keep pain at bay, but it also blocks any real chance of pleasure, fulfillment, or life. As Carl Jung wrote, the perpetual hesitation of the neurotic to step into life is easily explained by his desire to remain isolated, so as not to get involved in the risky fight for existence. But anyone who refuses to experience life must repress his desire to live. In other words, he must commit a partial suicide. Carl Jung, Symbols of Transformation. This partial suicide isn't an exaggerated metaphor. It's real. It's the gradual emptying of the soul, day after day. It's being a shadow of oneself. And perhaps, if you're hearing this, you feel something similar. Perhaps you too are on the margins of your own story. Lucas didn't just live hidden, he also lived in a state of restlessness. There were nights when he would wake up with a tight chest for no apparent reason. He'd break out in a cold sweat, his heart racing, thoughts as jumbled as a poorly tuned radio. He searched for diagnoses online, tried breathing techniques, avoided certain conversations and places, but nothing seemed to help. Until, on one particularly difficult night, amid the darkness of his room, he whispered to himself, "Maybe my soul is sick." Often, what we call a crisis, anxiety, or even depression isn't just a mental flaw. It might actually be an inner call, a desperate attempt by our unconscious to alert us that we are living against our own principles, desires, or vocations. As Jung aptly observed, the eruption of a neurosis does not happen by chance. It is usually at the moment when a new psychological adjustment, a new adaptation, is needed. Carl Jung, Freud, and psychoanalysis. In other words, when the soul screams through the body, it is because the current way of living is no longer sufficient. It's like wearing clothes that have become too tight over the years. The pressure builds until they tear. The neurosis is the tear, and although it is frightening, it also points out a way forward. But what do we usually do? We try to silence that alarm. We want to continue as before, keeping everything under control, everything just the same. Yet, ignoring that signal doesn't save us. It only delays the inevitable. And the longer we delay, the louder the body screams, and the more intense the pain becomes. And you? Are you listening to the signs? Are you ignoring the call from within? If these words resonate with you, take a moment and click the subscribe button, because this channel is exactly for those tired of running from their own truth. Lucas believed that understanding his past was enough to liberate him. He relived the muffled screams of his father in the kitchen, his mother's long silences in the living room, the cold stares at school. He did this for months in therapy, but the pain remained, untouched. One afternoon, after another heavy session, he asked his therapist, "Will I ever get rid of this?" The therapist took a deep breath and answered firmly, yet without judgment, "Lucas, maybe the problem isn't in the past anymore. Perhaps now the choice is yours." Those words silenced him. For the first time, he realized that understanding the past was necessary, but not sufficient. Staying there was, in a way, hiding. As Carl Jung clearly stated, the path to recovery does not require reviving childhood memories or working through old family conflicts. Unless we have been victims of some trauma we still have to process, our childhood memories will not free us from our present suffering. Carl Jung. True transformation demands something even tougher: presence, the courage to look at life as it is now, with its demands, its contradictions, its genuine pains. It is, as Jung would say, a sincere dedication to life, symbols of transformation. But that doesn't merely mean thinking positive. It means looking in the mirror and saying, "Enough, Enough of lying to yourself, of pretending that everything's okay. Change starts when you decide, in a quiet and intimate way, to reclaim your own life. But what does it truly mean to reclaim your own life? What would be the first steps of someone who finally decides to put themselves back into the world? Lucas was never a morning person, but that particular morning, something pulled him out of bed before the alarm even went off. It wasn't anxiety, it was something else. A quiet desire not to let the day slip away like the others. He got up, made coffee, and sat by the window, watching the light filter through the trees. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel the urge to hide. He decided to go out. He grabbed his guitar, crossed the street, and headed to the park. He sat on a bench near the bandstand and began to play. His voice was trembling, his fingers uncertain. A group of teenagers laughed as they passed by. An elderly woman stopped for 2 minutes and then continued on without a word. It was uncomfortable, and yet, it was real. That morning, Lucas realized something that no therapy session had ever made so clear. He could live in the world, even with fear. Carl Jung said that it isn't enough to exist as part of a system revolving around other people's desires and expectations. At some point in life, we need to recenter ourselves, to take on the role of the protagonist, not in a narcissistic sense, but in an existential one. As he wrote, all the energy that was tied up in family bonds needs to be reallocated from the smaller circle to a larger one, because the physical health of the adult individual, who in childhood was merely a particle revolving around a rotating system, requires that he himself become the center of a new system. Carl Jung, Symbols of Transformation. This is where many fail. They continue living as if they were mere supporting characters, adapting to the world around them, molding themselves to please, avoiding any decision that would confront them with the freedom and burden of choosing. But there's something powerful in becoming the center. You stop waiting for permission. You stop outsourcing your pain. You begin to understand that life won't hold your hand, but it won't stop you from getting up either. Lucas had begun to show himself to the world, but would he be ready to truly see himself? Without masks, without shortcuts, Lucas thought he had already done the hardest part. Playing in public, leaving the house, facing his fears, but nothing had prepared him for the most challenging moment of all. Sitting in front of the mirror and seeing, with brutal honesty, who he had become. It was on an ordinary night, after a shower, when he passed through the living room and his reflection surprised him. He stopped. He leaned against the wall. He stayed there, observing, not his face, but the weight in his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the old sorrow he had disguised with jokes and silences. And there, with no one around and without having to pretend strength, he whispered to himself, "I'm tired of hiding from myself." This is a sacred and painful moment. The moment when we stop running, blaming the world, or making excuses. There is no recovery possible without that first act of acceptance. Without admitting, this is who I am now, but it's not all I can be. Carl Jung wrote clearly, "A neurosis is not a disgrace. It is not a fatal disease, but it worsens as long as we insist on ignoring it." Carl Jung, Civilization in Transition. Denying the pain doesn't erase it. It merely buries it alive, so that it continues to act in silence. When we accept our faults, our weaknesses, and even our darkest impulses, something extraordinary happens. We stop wasting energy fighting ourselves. And that energy, once used to maintain the facade, can finally be directed toward building something new. Many are afraid to look themselves in the eye, fearing they will only find monsters. But the truth is, more often than not, they find a wounded child, waiting to be seen. But can we ever see ourselves completely alone? Who am I? When I'm not trying to appear strong for anyone. After that encounter with the mirror, Lucas felt a strange urge. He wanted to know what others really thought of him, not seeking validation, but out of a deep need for clarity. For years, he had lived under layers and masks, and now he needed to know, how do people perceive me when I'm not trying to please anyone? He decided to talk to Marina, an old friend who had known him for more than 20 years. They took a walk in the park at dusk, just like they did in their youth. He got straight to the point. "Tell me honestly, who do you think I am today?" She was silent for several long seconds. Then she said tenderly, You are someone beautiful on the inside, Lucas. But you keep hiding everything beautiful about you. He didn't cry, but something inside him collapsed. For the first time, someone had told him a truth he himself had avoided, that his greatest enemy wasn't fear nor society. It was his constant denial of who he was and what he could become. Jung understood the therapeutic power of another's gaze when used responsibly. He wrote, "One of the most important therapeutically effective factors is to subject oneself to the objective judgment of others." Carl Jung, The Theory of Psychoanalysis. Of course, this doesn't mean accepting anyone's opinion, but it means courageously seeking an honest reflection that only those who see us with love and clarity can offer. Sometimes these are the people who hold the mirror when we can no longer do it ourselves. If there's someone in your life who you know truly sees you, consider opening that space for a conversation. It may hurt, but it can also set you free. But is hearing a truth enough to change everything? Or do some wounds persist, even after we begin to awaken? After the conversation with Marina, Lucas felt as if an invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Yet days later, when he resumed his routine, he noticed something strange. The anxiety hadn't vanished. It returned at random moments. On the subway, when opening his banking app, even before bed, his first reaction was the same as always: to control. He used breathing techniques, distracted himself with videos, walked in compulsive circles. He tried to convince himself that it was just a matter of keeping the symptoms in check. But the relief was always temporary. It was like placing band-aids on a wound that needed stitches. That's when he realized he was trying to survive, not live. He was dealing with the effects, but avoiding the cause. His life revolved around sidestepping triggers and not seeking a new path. Carl Jung warned about this common mistake. The neurotic who tries to dodge the need to live gains nothing and only burdens himself with the constant anticipation of the law of aging and death. Carl Jung, Symbols of Transformation. Lucas was creating an ever smaller world for himself. He avoided busy streets, deep conversations, risky decisions, but with each act of avoidance, his freedom decreased, and along with it, his joy, his spontaneity, his soul. Managing symptoms can be a first step, but it is not the final destination. If you feel like you're living in this mode of constant control, perhaps it's time to ask, what are you trying to avoid? And what are you missing out on because of it? Lucas began to notice something disconcerting. As exhausting as facing life was, it was still less suffocating than trying to avoid it. Every small step out of his comfort zone, playing in public, discussing his fears with someone, going out even with a racing heart, was frightening, but at the same time, life-affirming. The old way of living, where he only tried not to feel anything, increasingly felt like an invisible prison. Jung compared the healing process to a steep climb, an immense effort, yes, but one that leads to a peak where the air is pure, where, at long last, life can be seen in perspective. And he issued a powerful warning about those who, out of fear of the effort, remain in the valley. They sit on the pleasant path in the valley below, without realizing that a furious bull is charging directly at them. Paraphrase of Jung. If you feel that you are in that valley, stagnant, paralyzed, perhaps it's time to climb. Because as frightening as the ascent may seem, being trampled by the life you insist on avoiding is even more devastating. Lucas decided to leave the valley. But what he didn't expect was to discover that pain, rather than being the obstacle, was the guide. Why? Lucas began to see his pain with different eyes. Before, he viewed anxiety as an enemy, something to be eliminated. Now he started to understand it as a signal, an invitation. Uncomfortable, yes, but necessary, to rebuild his life on new foundations. And in this new perspective, something surprising began to happen. Neurosis was no longer just suffering. It was also a revelation. Jung, with his usual depth, saw precisely this potential contained in psychic pain. For him, neurosis isn't a flaw of the organism, but an attempt at adaptation, a failed attempt perhaps, but still an effort of the soul to reorganize. He wrote, "Neurosis is only a curse if we remain chained to it forever, but it will prove a blessing if we can find a way out." Carl Jung. That's what Lucas began to experience. Instead of asking himself, "Why do I feel this way?" he started asking, "What is this trying to show me?" And this shift in question was transformative. It gave meaning to the suffering. It rendered it fertile. Pain now was no longer an endless tunnel. It was a passage, difficult, dark, narrow, but one that led him to a new place, a place where he could finally breathe, not the absence of symptoms, but the presence of purpose. And here lies the paradox. Sometimes the one who has suffered most deeply also becomes the one who loves most intensely, who lives with greater presence, who better understands the pain of others, as if the journey through the shadows revealed the value of the light. If you're in the midst of this passage, don't give up. You may not yet see what lies on the other side, but know that there is something, and it may be more beautiful than you imagine. It was at this point that life, with its unpredictable way of testing the sincerity of an awakening, placed Lucas before a real choice. It wasn't a planned decision. Lucas was walking back from the market when he heard music coming from a bar on the corner. It was an improv session. A small group with acoustic instruments, an open mic, and inviting glances. Something inside him stirred. He didn't think. He just went in. He took off his jacket, sat on the edge, and, in a gesture he didn't even understand at the time, raised his hand and requested a turn. The words came like an ancient wind. He hummed a verse he had composed months before. His voice trembled, but he didn't stop. When he finished, there was a brief silence, followed by timid applause and a few smiles. He didn't leave with a job offer or even a new friend, but he left changed. For the first time, he had done something not because he was ready, but because he felt he needed to. Jung believed there are forces within us that cannot be analyzed or tamed, only followed. He said, "The true solution lies in action. We must stop being mere observers of life and venture into the strange world with all its unpredictable possibilities." Carl Jung, Symbols of Transformation. But that action isn't calculated, nor perfect. It's imperfect, impulsive, full of stumbles. And even so, it's alive. How many times have you felt the urge to do something, speak, create, change, and held back for fear of judgment, rejection, or looking ridiculous? Perhaps salvation lies in those impulses you've always suppressed. Perhaps it's not about a perfect plan, but about responding to life with courage and a touch of madness. Lucas had begun to let go, but is it really possible to live fully in a world that only applauds shortened versions of ourselves? Lucas started to notice a problem he had never faced before, having spent years hiding: the judgment of others. Lucas always tried to be proper. He followed the rules. He concealed his anguish, until one day, after leaving a work meeting where he was praised for being discreet and aligned, he had a thought that frightened him. They are applauding the version of me that is making me ill. Carl Jung had already noted this paradox. Society tends to praise exactly what keeps us imprisoned: the obedience, the adaptation, the apparent calm. But to him, that wasn't a sign of health. It was a symptom of being disconnected from one's own essence. Or as he put it, or in Jung's own words, seeing not a virtue, but a prison. They are only neurotic as long as they bow to authority and refuse the freedom for which they are destined. Carl Jung. So, if instead of being calm or aligned, you feel too sensitive, too deep, too intense, maybe you aren't sick. Perhaps you are simply in transition. Because of this, Lucas decided to let all his sensitivity and restlessness flow and chose to write a letter. He grabbed paper and pen and wrote to himself as if he were a friend. He poured it all out: his fears, his failures, his forgotten dreams. He asked for forgiveness, and he sincerely promised, "I will choose myself again." And perhaps writing this letter was Lucas's first step toward reclaiming his life. So if all of this spoke to you, if something inside you has been ignited, seize this moment and subscribe now. But not as just another click, as a symbolic gesture, a silent pact with your own courage. Because in the end, no one is ever truly ready, but those who live do it anyway.